Okay, the last thing that we're going to cover with this graphing stuff is actually how to go backwards. So if you've been given a trigonometric graph, how do we come up with a function to go with it? It's certainly a little bit trickier. You have to make your way backwards through all the math. But for those of you that absolutely hate making graphs, you might find it a little bit more satisfying. We pretty much are just going to go through and use the same information to figure something like this out. Yeah, you probably want to start with identifying your center axis and your amplitude. So in this graph that I've given you here, it does look like it's a wave, a trigonometric wave. It's going up and down between two values. I've labeled 12 and 32. It's pretty reasonable to assume that that's going to be your max and your min. So we should be able to actually use that information to find both the center axis and the amplitude. So the max is 32 and the min is 12 to get the center and the amplitude. There's a few different ways that you could look at it. You could use the center is actually just the average of those two values, or the middle value. So that'll be 22. So it's the average of the min and max, which is 12, plus 32 over 2, which is 22. And then from there, you can use that the amplitude is basically, well, if we now know that the center is at 22, we can see that the amplitude goes down 10, up 10. And so from that info, that tells you both my A and my K value. So here, the center is K, which is 22, and my amplitude is A, which is 10. You could have also done that in reverse. You could have said that we know that the amplitude is, there's two amplitudes in that total distance between the min and the max. It's a distance of 20, so the amplitude is therefore 10. And then use that 10 to get the center. Doesn't really matter, whatever your preference is, but you should be able to get those two numbers from that info. Now the harder part is going to be getting our B and our H, and this is ultimately going to depend on whether or not we choose to use a sine or a cosine function. So it's going to differ. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is split this up. If I choose to use sine, the easiest thing to look for is what sine looks like. So when sine starts, remember it goes up like this. So what we're looking for is that middle point where it starts going up. So this is a middle point, but it's actually going down after. So that's not the one that I want. This is a middle point where it starts going up, just like I've got in my sine. So that would be my starting point. And in case you are wondering, it might be hard to narrow down exactly where that is. But my min's at 3 and my max is at 8. It should be halfway between. There's all sorts of symmetry with these graphs. So in that case, oh, sorry, that's not B that I'm looking for. This is H. So that would be my starting point at 5.5. If I were to do cosine, this one's actually a little bit easier to identify because it always just starts at the top. So my starting point is just a max. It can be any max. And it doesn't really matter because all the maxes, it's always the same behavior. It goes up to the max and then down afterwards. So you could actually, if you wanted, choose either the one at 8, or you could try and figure out where this one is. It's not as clearly labeled. We'll probably use this one for the cosine. So I'm going to use that one there. It starts at x equals 8. And so that's going to be my H in that case. And yeah, so all we have to do at this point is get B. So B is going to come from the period. And if you remember when doing the graphs, we actually had this formula that the period is, I'm going to use radians, 2 pi divided by b. We should actually be able to use that to figure out what b is going to be. So if I look at this picture, my period, I did kind of set this up to go, it looks like 10 to 10. Yeah, so it goes, sorry, -2 to 8, or we can see that like the lower half here goes from 3 to 5. But my period is supposed to be 10 for this picture. You can just use the fact that the min is at 3 and the max is at 8. That should be half of the total distance to get the fact that my period is 10. And this should actually allow me to solve for my b. So 2 pi over 10 or pi over 5. And so yeah, now all that I need to do is put the two equations together. There will be two. I did ask for a sine or a cosine. They'll just have a slightly different b value, h value, just because remember the sine and the cosine functions are just shifts of each other. So if I set up the cosine one, I would have y equals, I've got my a was 10, cos, I've got my b is pi over 5, x minus, this h is 8, and then plus 22. And if I choose to use the sine one, it would be very similar. It's just a different shift. But all the other numbers are the exact same because the graphs are very, very similar. So you just kind of work your way backwards to get this equation. Yeah, start with your a and k, and then just use period and starting point to get b and h.